I've kind of felt like my whole life has been one big fantasy camp. Every time I take the stage with these great musicians or make a record with great musicians, or I just feel so privileged, and it's still very exciting for me.
From NCPR, this is Northwards. Conversations you'll want to hear about people, ideas, and music in Northern New York, Vermont, Ontario, Quebec, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities.
When I say drummer Barry Keane has played and recorded with a lot of fellow musicians, I don't believe I'm exaggerating. But in case you think I'm exaggerating, I have assigned producer Ethan Shanty to read the names of the musicians Keane lists on his biography.
Anne Murray, Bachman-Turner Overdrive, Shania Twain, Dan Hill, THP Orchestra, Carole King, Richard Whittaker, Ian Tyson, Dave Loggins, The Nylons, April Wine, George Hamilton IV, Wilf Carter, Ian Thomas, Rita McNeil, Tommy Hunter.
Some of those
Diane
names,
Brooks,
like Shania
Michelle
Twain
White,
and Bachman-Turner Overdrive, are probably familiar to you. Others might not be, though they amount to a veritable who's who of Canadian recording artists.
Immortals, the Good Brothers, Terry Carice, Susan Jacks, Silver and DeGazio, Albert Hall, Sticky Fingers, Ronnie Prophet, Mark Jordan, The Family Brown.
Over
Red
5
Rockets,
decades
Red Black,
as a professional musician, there is one guy Barry Keane has played with more than anyone else, the legendary Gordon Lightfoot. Keane first sat down at a drum set backing the late singer-songwriter in the early 1970s and stayed there, recording and touring with Lightfoot for the next 47 years. Gordon Lightfoot passed away last year at the age of 84, but recently the members of his band, including Keane, bass player Rick Haynes, keyboardist Mike Heffernan, guitarist Carter Lancaster, and new vocalist Andy Mock, have hit the road to continue sharing Lightfoot's songs with audiences. They will play a show in Brockville on April 19th. While Gordon Lightfoot's career is certainly interesting, Barry Keane has lived a life that is equally fascinating to hear about, and you probably haven't heard about it yet, and so that's what we're going to do now. Barry Keane, it is truly a pleasure to meet you.
Well, Mitch, I appreciate you doing this, and it's great to be on with you, so thank you.
So it has been, I guess, not quite a year since Gordon Lightfoot passed away, and the thing that I'm maybe most curious about is how you and your fellow band members are holding up. It must still feel a little strange to take the stage without him.
Absolutely. It's a combination of emotions we have. It's definitely strange. I mean, the man that made the whole thing happen, and for 4 of us, the newest member of the band has been in the band for 13 years, and the rest of us had spent decades recording and touring with Gordon. So when you take the main, you take the main man out of the equation, it is definitely different. We've been having a great time. We've done, 4 shows now with the new member, Andy Mock, who is handling vocals and rhythm guitar, and everybody seems to be handling it about as well as we could, Mitch. It's, it's a combination of, we went through a grieving period, which some of us still are, but it's, onward and upward, and people seem to really be taking to the new band, taking to Andy, so it's all very encouraging.
Are you sharing stories about recording and touring with him while you're on stage?
Absolutely. We have we have that unique perspective that we were there. We were there for the records. We were there for the tours. When you tour with somebody personally, I was with Gord for 47 years. We did an album 52 years ago, but I toured with him as his one and only touring drummer. And when you travel with someone, when you're on an airplane for hours at a time, when you're in a venue for hours at a time, of course there's going to be stories, and of course you're going to relate those experiences. And we never want to shed a bad light on Gord, for sure. It's not like we're telling tales out of school, but we have stories that the audiences seem to really appreciate so far.
You played with Gordon for 47 years, and as you said, you recorded with him 52 years ago. Your bandmate Rick Haynes played with him even longer. What was it about the chemistry among the three of you that kept you together all those years?
It was, well, for Rick and Rick, as you said, he precedes me. Rick had been with Gord since 1968, which is, it's crazy to think about. In show business, that kind of thing just really is so rare. But one of the really good things about touring with Gord, the only time we ever toured on a tour bus was the two times we toured in the UK. And otherwise, Gord treated us so well. We traveled almost exclusively on private jets. We had our own single hotel rooms. So we would be together for maybe most of the time, 11 or 12 days at a time. And just when you're starting to get on each other's nerves, you go home and you can get away from each other for a while. And then you're really happy to see each other again. And I know from working with a lot of different musicians, when you're on a tour bus or when you have a roommate, and you can really get on each other's nerves fairly quickly. So I think that was part of the reason that we got along so well. And Gord treated us. Everything was first class, always was first class, and there was a mutual respect for what he did, obviously, and he had a respect for what we did and do, and I think it was all part of it.
There had to be a certain amount of trust as well.
Well, I think there's no question, and he let us know that, and there was trust going both ways. We trusted Gord to do what he did and to treat us the way he did, and Gord could always count on us. We were, we're not one of those drug-oriented kind of individuals, and we always were very professional, and he treated us professionally. We treated him professionally, so there was definitely a mutual trust.
There are no Barry Keane trashed hotel rooms stories in your past, then?
No, Mitch, I can honestly say there's not one.
I gather you kind of grew up in the record industry. What led you to meet Gordon Lightfoot in the first place?
Oh, my goodness. Yes, people say, what was your biggest break in the music business? And I'm always proud to say having my father run a record company, which not many people, have that privilege. But so I was introduced to the record business very early. But one of the other big breaks I had was, and this is a crazy story, but it's true. Another big break for me was having an assistant engineer accidentally erase a drum track. It was when I was the A&R man for RCA Records in Toronto, and I had signed a power trio out of Montreal called Charlie. And they were in the process of mixing their album, and one of the assistant engineers accidentally erased a drum track. And so the head engineer on the project called me, and it was on a Sunday night, I remember it clearly. And he said, the drummer's gone home, has gone back to Montreal, and we need to replace the drum track. Do you know any drummers? And off the top of my head, to play that kind of music, on the spur of the moment, I couldn't think of a single one. And then the engineer, whose name is Mark Smith, said, well, you're a drummer. And now, Mitch, I had decided that I was now a record executive, and I was going to leave playing the drums in my past. It was time to move on. It was time to mature and become the record executive that I was. And so I hadn't played the drums in a long time. And Mark said, well, you're a drummer. We have a rented set here. Why don't you come and replace the track? I said, I wouldn't be any good. I don't think I would do a good job. And Mark said, well, we're paying for the studio time, and unless you can think of somebody else, why don't you give it a shot? So long story short, I played on the track, and the lead guitar player, the singer, wonderful fellow named Walter Rossi, who was kind of in the Jimi Hendrix style of playing. He had toured with Buddy Miles and Wilson Pickett. Wonderful guitar player. He loved what I did on the track. And just coincidentally, Gordon Lightfoot was scheduled to do an album at RCA Studios in Toronto, and Mark was asked to hire some auxiliary musicians for the album to augment Gordon's touring group, which at the time was Rick Haynes on bass, Red Shea and Terry Clements on lead guitars. He needed a drummer, he needed a piano player, and some other instruments. So Mark, being familiar with me and my playing, hired me to play on the album, which turned out to be Old Dan's Records with Gordon Lightfoot back in 1972. And we got along very, very well and spoke over the next few years about possibly touring. He had never had a drummer. I had never toured with anybody. And so I ran into Gord at the Juno Awards, which is our Canadian Grammy Awards.
Of course, yep.
And Gord said, "Hey, man, I got an album coming up. I'd like you to play on it." And this was back in the end of 1975. And he said, "And I'd like to talk to you about going on tour. I think I really do need to add a drummer." So I played on the Summertime Dream album, which had some drum-oriented songs like The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald and Race Among the Ruins. And Gord thought, this is the time to add drums.
You think you had the last laugh, now you know this can't be true. Even though the sun shines down upon you now, sometimes you must feel blue. You make the best of each new day, you try not to be sad, even though the sky falls down upon you, call it midnight, feeling bad. When you wake up to the
But he really wasn't sure about it, so he was hesitant to take me on like on a full-time basis. And I was hesitant. I had a full-time job in the record business. I didn't know if I would like touring. He didn't know if he would like having a drummer. So we came to a handshake agreement that we would take it pretty much one tour, one show at a time to try it out. And that was the way things were for 47 years, Midge.
other ones who by the magic of the moment were mysteriously undone. You try to understand.
At any moment, you thought I could go back to being an A&R man for RCA?
Well, I was starting to think that I was never going to become my father, and I wasn't sure that that's really where my interest was laying. It was a couple of such lucky breaks that took me on this path, and I really did take to playing on people's records. I was lucky enough to be hired to play on a few people's records, and I really was enjoying that more than I really ever did being in most of the parts of the record business that I was in. So, again, how lucky can a guy be when an opportunity is presented to you and, a door opens, you go through it, and it's like it turns out to be wonderful.
Yeah. Well, and you said you were lucky enough to play on a few people's records. I was looking at the list, and I could start reading them, but it would take us the rest of the interview. There are so many names, from Anne Murray to Bachman-Turner Overdrive to Shania Twain, but while people would recognize those names, they might not necessarily recognize your name. Was there ever a point in this journey that you took that you thought, well, I really wish there could have been a Barry Keane band?
No, honestly, there was a time back when I worked with some wonderful producers, a couple of guys named Ian Gunther and Willie Morrison, and they were the THP. They were the Three Hats production guys, and we did a whole whack of disco-oriented records together. It was me and two other guys from Toronto, and then four guys from Memphis. We got together, and we backed a bunch of different artists playing disco records, and they approached me about maybe doing an instrumental and calling it the Barry Keane group or whatever. But it came close to materializing. It never materialized. But that's as close as I came. And really, I've never had a desire to have a Barry Keane group, to be honest.
Playing with all of these different artists, being able to adapt to all these different styles is not something that every drummer or every musician can do.
No, and again, how lucky can one guy be? Right at the time when I was starting to do, this is back in 72-ish, around that time, I had a style and a sound that was different from the other guys who were doing recordings, the guys that were hired to play on movie soundtracks and TV scores and albums with people. And some of it was based on my lack of knowledge of music, that I played a very simple style. And from having listened to records for all the years, and I love records, I've always loved records, especially pop records. So I knew how to get a sound to make it sound like the guys that I liked hearing on record. And people started appreciating that. Well, then I started getting hired for more and more sessions, Mitch, and I was in way over my head I never knew how to read music, other styles of music other than, beyond the range of Paul Revere and the Raiders and the Dave Clark Five and the Beatles. And beyond that, I really didn't have a big range of music. But I was kind of brought along by people who taught me how to read enough to get through. And I got hired to be the house band drummer on the national country TV show up here in Canada. And I didn't know a lot about country music, but you can imagine when you're backing Dolly Parton and Ray Price and George Jones, and all of a sudden you get a crash course in what is good about country music. And I was kind of brought along, and how fortunate can I be?
Yeah. Does it ever get old? I mean, you go on Jimmy Fallon, or you play on somebody's album, or you take the stage with your Gordon Lightfoot bandmates. Do you ever have a moment where you think, I've done this a million times before, and how could tonight be any different than any other night?
The only time it ever got to be a little bit old for me was Gordon he worked unbelievably hard at his craft, at what we did. When we would play, there were a lot of times, there were years where we would do an 11-day tour, and it would consist of 5 shows in 5 different cities in 5 days, a travel day, and then 5 shows in 5 different cities in 5 days. So we would have been in 10 different cities, doing 10 shows in 10 different cities in an 11-day period. And Gordon insisted on having a rehearsal every single day before every concert. And we would play at least part of every song. And so you can imagine by day 7 or 8 or 9, after you've played 7 or 8 concerts already, and now you're rehearsing songs that you have played for 20 or 30 or 40 years. I got to admit, that got to be a little bit old at times.
I can imagine.
But the concerts and TV shows, and I have felt like you know how people pay thousands to go to fantasy camps for music fantasy camps or sports fantasy camps? I've kind of felt like my whole life has been one big fantasy camp, to be honest. And I just feel fortunate. I feel lucky. And so every time I take the stage with these great musicians or make a record with great musicians, or I just feel so privileged, and it's still very exciting for me.
Oh, that's great. So you were in the studio working with Gordon when he recorded the record, the Edmund Fitzgerald, and at that moment, I mean, the rec had not been that long before. Did it seem like a song that people would still be singing 50 years later?
No chance. I mean, there's a couple of parts of this, again, some very fortunate things happening. That record wasn't even supposed to be on the album, on the Summertime Dream album. It was an event that happened. Gord read the story in Newsweek magazine, and he was just starting to put the song together when we were recording the Summertime Dream album. We had recorded the entire album. We got to the end, and Gord, it was a Thursday afternoon. We were booked for the rest of that day and Friday. And Gord said, "Hey, guys, we're done. Thank you. It was great." And the recording engineer came on the talkback and said, "What about that Shipwreck song?" Because every day in the studio, the last thing Gord would do would be strum that Shipwreck song that none of us had heard. But he kept strumming this thing. Pee-wee, the steel player, Terry, the lead guitar player, they eventually came up with some parts. Anyway, Kenny, the engineer, said, "Well, why don't we put that Shipwreck song down on tape? Because you got the musicians booked, we got the studio booked, you got nothing to lose." So Gord finally relented and said, "Yeah, okay, so Terry, Pee-wee, play that part you do, and Rick, play what you play." And I said to Gord, "When do you want me to come in?" Because, Mitch, we'd never even heard the song. It wasn't like it was a first take. We had never heard the song. Gord was about to play this song that he had written about the shipwreck, and I said to him, "When do you want me to come in?" He said, "I will give you a nod." And I remember distinctly sitting in the drum booth. I could see Gord across the room, and I sat there. And not having heard the song, we're now, a couple of minutes into the song, and I thought, well, he forgot to cue me, because this thing must be over pretty soon. Anyway, Gord gave me a nod. I did a drum fill, came in and played. We played the song till the end. And, Mitch, that's the record.
The wind in the wires made a tattletale sound, and the wave broke over the railing. And every man knew, as the captain did too, 'twas the witch of November come stealing.
Like, that just doesn't happen. The fact, first takes are rare enough, where you've rehearsed something for months, you go in the studio, you record it, first take. This was the first time we'd ever played that song. And we came in, I think we tried to play it again right afterward, and I know we came in on the Friday, the next day, because Gord said, well, we'll do it for real now. We'll real. It was never the same.
When supper time came, the old cook came on deck saying, fellas, it's too rough to feed you. 7 p.m. a main hatchway caved in. He said, fellas, it's been good to know you.
There was a certain tension in the recording of the song, and I remember I felt tense because I didn't know the song, so I didn't know really where I was supposed to do a fill or not do a fill, so there was a certain tension that we all felt that is in that record that I think is part of the charm of the record. And then to get to the other part, I remember going with Gordon to a meeting with the president of Warner Brothers, Mo Austin, out in Los Angeles. We were playing a show out in L.A., and Mo wanted Gord to go in, and Gord asked me to go with him. We went in, and Mo Austin said, well, you know, things are going well, Gordon, and we're talking about coming up with a single from the album. We've been getting a lot of airplay on that Shipwreck song. And Gord and I kind of looked at each other like, you're not talking about making this a single. It's a 6-minute song about a ship that sank in the great... This isn't yummy, 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 I got love in my tummy. This is pretty far away from what we thought of as a hit single. And Mo Austin said, well, we're getting an awful lot of play on this, and we're thinking about maybe editing it down and maybe, you know, presenting it to AM radio. And Gord and I, again, looked at each other like, no way. There's no way this is a hit record. But anyway, they went ahead, and the rest is history.
Wow. I will admit to owning the 45 RPM version of that song.
Thank you.
Well, and you know, just to hear your telling of it. First of all, I was speechless as you were telling that story. It floored to imagine that your part on that was played during the first time you had ever heard the song.
Correct. That's part of what makes that record great, I think, is that we all played what we felt. And again, there was tension in the playing of it, and I think you can feel that tension in the record. But that kind of thing just doesn't happen in the record business, Mitch. You don't go in and go, hey, guys, I got this song, and play what you feel like, and here it is, and have it become... I remember a friend of mine happened to be the coach of the U.S. women's Olympic hockey team. He called me from Sweden one time and said, I have to tell you, you can't believe what's on the radio here. What's that? The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. It's like, it's crazy to think that it was an international hit record.
Playing music in the model that you did, whether it was, you know, going on tour for, you know, 11 days at a time, or sitting in for a day with this musician or a few days with that musician, do you feel like it had a positive effect on the other things that you've been able to do over the course of your life? If I read your biography right, I mean, you got to play a lot of sports still while you were a working musician.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, how lucky am I that people would allow me to not be there for the entire season, you know, for a sports team and that kind of thing. And I played on some pretty good teams, I have to say. Well, one of the slow pitch teams, we won a world championship back in 2007. So I played on some pretty good teams and was lucky that people understood that I couldn't be there all the time. And another kind of tension is when you're hired to play on a commercial, a jingle, and it's booked for an hour, and you're in there with 20 or 30 people, and now there's 3 minutes to go in the hour, or everybody gets paid overtime. And okay, guys, this better be the take. So, you know, how much pressure is on the drummer to play a perfect track, or it's going to cost the producer thousands of dollars. So, and is there adrenaline flow when you're at bat in a world championship? And of course, those things, you know, you can take what you've learned from one aspect of your life and apply it to the other aspect of your life. And again, my whole life has been kind of one fantasy camp, Mitch.
Well, so here's a strange question. Maybe it's a strange question. You're in a store, you're a hardware store, or a drugstore, or something like that. You're checking out. There's music on the speakers, and suddenly you realize that the music that is playing on the speakers is a song that you played the drums on. Do you tell the cashier?
I have. I have done exactly that. Yeah, I'm very proud. I'm very proud of the work I've done. And I was at a convenience store recently, and we had an article come out in the Toronto Star. And Rick, the bass player, because I knew the article was online, But he said, have you seen the paper? And I said, no, because it had individual pictures of each of us in it. And I went to a convenience store, and I picked up a copy, and I opened it to make sure it was in there. And I did. I got the clerk behind the counter, and I said, hey, that's me right there. Mitch, I don't know what I'm going to do when I grow up. Honestly, I don't. But I have such a great time with all of this, and I'm very proud of everything. And what else can I say?
Wow. That is, it really, I mean, it sounds like a fantasy camp. It sounds like so many metaphors, but it's real, and it's amazing to hear you talk about it.
Well, thank you, and thank you for asking me about it. And again, I just feel, every single day I feel lucky.
Barry Keane has played drums for, by my count, roughly 250 recording artists over a half century, including Gordon Lightfoot, with whom he played and recorded for 47 years. Following Lightfoot's death last year, Keane and the other members of the Canadian singer-songwriters band are now touring as the Lightfoot Band. They'll play a show at the Brockville Arts Center on April 19th. And if you have gotten this far, I apologize for getting the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald stuck in your head as well. I'm Mitch Tyke. Hope you enjoyed our chat with Barry Keane. You can find out more about him and everyone in the Lightfoot Band by visiting ncpr.org/northwords. That's where you can also rummage through our back catalog and listen to all the old episodes of Northwords your heart desires. Ethan Shanty joins us now with a list of everyone that comes together to make this show possible.
Northwords is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, edited, and produced by Mitch Tyke with digital production supervision by me, Ethan Shanty. Caitlin Kelly handles our social media, Bill Hanel is our digital director, and Doyle Dean is our production manager. Music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. To support this show and find more podcasts, visit ncpr.org. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.